What if you could walk into any room and immediately know who to trust, who is hiding something, and who genuinely wants to help you? What if you could sit across from someone at a dinner table and understand exactly what they are feeling before they say a single word? What if you could stop being blindsided by people who smile to your face and mean something completely different behind your back? You already have this ability. You were born with it. But somewhere along the way, school taught you algebra and nobody taught you people. Nobody sat you down and explained how human beings actually communicate. How much of what we say has nothing to do with the words coming out of our mouths, and how the body, the eyes, the voice, and the energy a person carries all tell a truer story than any sentence ever could. Reading people is not a superpower reserved for detectives, therapists, or con artists. It is a learnable science. It is a skill built on decades of psychological research, behavioral study, and neuroscience. And once you understand how it works, the world around you will never look the same. This is not about becoming manipulative or suspicious of everyone you meet. This is about becoming fluent in the language that human beings have been speaking since before words existed. It is about understanding people more deeply, connecting more authentically, protecting yourself more wisely, and showing up in every relationship with far greater clarity. Welcome to the science of reading people. Let us begin. Chapter 1. The Body Never Lies. Understanding Nonverbal Communication. Imagine you are watching a movie with the sound completely off. No dialogue, no music, just faces, hands, posture, and movement. You would still understand most of what is happening. You would know who is angry and who is nervous. You would feel the tension in a room before anyone raises their voice. You would see the love between two people before they ever touch. That is because the body is always speaking. Long before human beings developed language, we communicated entirely through physical signals. We read each other through movement, proximity, posture, and expression. That ancient wiring is still running inside every person you have ever met, and it is far more honest than words. Research conducted by psychologist Albert Mehrabian, whose work has become foundational in communication studies, suggested that when it comes to emotional communication, the words themselves carry only a small fraction of the total message. The rest is carried by tone of voice and body language. While that specific breakdown has been simplified over the years, the core truth it points to remains well supported. What people do with their bodies is often a far more reliable signal than what they choose to say. Here is the key insight that most people miss. The body communicates in clusters, not isolated gestures. One crossed arm means nothing on its own. Someone might be cold. Someone might be comfortable. But crossed arms combined with a tight jaw, a slightly turned away torso, and eyes that keep darting toward the exit tell a very different story. Reading people means learning to read the whole picture at once, not cherry-picking single signals and drawing conclusions from them alone. There are two broad categories of nonverbal behavior worth understanding. The first is baseline behavior. Every person has a normal, relaxed way of holding themselves, moving, and engaging. Some people naturally cross their arms. Some people talk with their hands. Some people rarely make eye contact in casual conversation. Before you can detect a meaningful shift in someone's body language, you need to know what normal looks like for them specifically. The second category is deviation from baseline. When someone who normally maintains steady eye contact suddenly starts looking away, something has shifted. When someone who usually speaks quickly starts choosing their words with unusual slowness, something is being calculated. It is the change from the norm that carries the signal, not the behavior itself in isolation. Real-life example, Jordan's interview. Jordan was preparing for a second-round job interview at a company she had wanted to work for since graduating college. Her coach had spent weeks helping her polish her answers, but in the actual interview something felt off. The hiring manager smiled pleasantly and asked all the right questions, but Jordan noticed that every time she talked about her experience with leadership, the manager gave a very small, almost imperceptible nod downward rather than upward, and her upper body would subtly rotate just slightly away. The words were professional and neutral, but the body was signaling disengagement. Jordan pivoted. She asked directly whether there was a concern about her leadership background she could address. The manager looked surprised, and then admitted there had been a question in the team about her years of experience. That honest conversation, opened by reading the room, turned the interview around. Jordan got the job. Practical takeaway: the baseline game. The next time you are in a conversation or a meeting, Spend the first 2 to 3 minutes doing nothing but observing the other person's natural state. How do they hold their shoulders? Where do their eyes rest when they are relaxed? How do they position their feet? Build that mental baseline. Then watch for anything that shifts. The shift is where the information lives. You are not looking for a reason to distrust anyone. You are building a vocabulary, and every conversation from this point forward is a chance to practice reading it. Let us talk about a few specific nonverbal signals that consistently show up in research as meaningful across different populations and contexts. Foot direction is one of the least discussed but most reliable indicators in all of body language science. People tend to point their feet toward things they are genuinely interested in, and away from things or people they want to leave behind. In a group conversation, where a person's feet are pointed, often tells you more about where their mind is than anything their face is doing. Someone whose torso is angled into the conversation, but whose feet are pointed toward the exit is, on some level, already halfway out the door. Touch behavior is another powerful signal. The way people touch their own face, neck, or torso during a conversation is often a form of self-soothing. When people feel stressed, anxious, or uncertain, the nervous system reaches for calming input, and self-touch provides it. A hand moving to cover the throat, a person rubbing the back of their neck, a finger pressed briefly to the lips. These are not signs of deception, as pop psychology has often claimed. They are signs of discomfort. The question worth asking is, what in the current conversation is producing that discomfort? Proximity and personal space carry their own set of signals. Research by anthropologist Edward Hall mapped what he called proxemic zones, the socially negotiated distances at which people are comfortable conducting different kinds of interaction. In American culture, intimate distance runs from 0 to about 18 inches and is reserved for people we trust deeply. Personal distance runs from roughly 18 inches to 4 feet and is the range for close friends and family. Social distance spans 4 to 12 feet and covers most professional interaction. Public distance begins at 12 feet and is the zone of formal presentations and strangers. When someone moves closer than their established relationship with you would normally justify, they are either testing a new level of intimacy, asserting dominance, or both. When someone consistently maintains more distance than the situation calls for, they are signaling comfort with formality, discomfort with closeness, or some degree of emotional guardedness. Neither is inherently negative. Both are informative. Chapter 2. The Face Tells Everything, Microexpressions and Emotional Leakage. The human face has 43 muscles. Most of them exist for no reason other than to express emotion. We are, quite literally, built to communicate feelings through our faces. And while we learn from a very young age to manage those expressions, to smile when we are uncomfortable, and to look calm when we are scared, the face still leaks the truth in tiny, involuntary flashes that last less than a quarter of a second. These are called microexpressions. They were brought to widespread scientific attention through the pioneering research of psychologist Paul Ekman, whose work identified 7 universal emotions and their corresponding facial expressions. These expressions appear across every culture on Earth, regardless of language, upbringing, or social norms. A person in rural Japan and a person in rural Texas make the same face when they feel disgust. A child who has never seen a television and a CEO in a Manhattan boardroom make the same face when they feel contempt. These are not learned behaviors. They are hardwired. The 7 universal microexpressions are happiness, sadness, fear, anger, surprise, disgust, and contempt. Each one involves specific muscle movements that are almost impossible to fake perfectly and nearly impossible to suppress completely when a genuine emotion is triggered. The corners of the mouth pulling back and up in genuine happiness also involves the muscles around the eyes, what researchers call the Duchenne marker. A fake smile almost never activates the eye muscles in the same way, which is why we instinctively know the difference between a smile that reaches someone's eyes and one that stops at the lips. Contempt is particularly important to learn to recognize because it is one-sided. It appears on only one side of the face, as a slight curl or tightening of one corner of the mouth. It signals a feeling of superiority or moral judgment toward the other person. When contempt flashes across someone's face in a conversation, it is one of the clearest signs that there is an underlying issue with respect in that relationship, something worth paying very close attention to. Emotional leakage happens when genuine emotions slip through despite a person's attempt to control their expression. A micro-expression of fear when someone claims they are fine. A flash of sadness when someone insists they have moved on. A burst of anger that someone quickly covers with a laugh. These leaks are not always signs of deception. They are signs of suppression, and suppression itself is meaningful. It tells you that the emotion is real and present, even if it is not being acknowledged. Real life example: Marcus and his business partner. Marcus had been running a small marketing agency with his partner Derek for 4 years. They had always communicated openly, or so Marcus believed. One afternoon, Marcus pitched a new direction for the company's services. Derek listened, nodded, and said he was excited about it. But as Marcus described the plan, he caught something on Derek's face for just a fraction of a second. It was a tightening of the nose and upper lip. Disgust, or something close to it. Marcus paused the pitch and asked simply, "What is the real reaction?" Derek exhaled and admitted he had concerns he had not wanted to raise because he thought Marcus was too invested in the idea. That conversation, triggered by reading a quarter-second expression, saved them from moving forward with a plan one partner secretly opposed. They revised the strategy together and had one of their best quarters as a result. Practical takeaway: the expression journal. Begin watching faces more deliberately this week. When you are watching a conversation in a public space, a television interview, or a meeting, watch not just for what people express, but for what they almost express and then pull back. Notice the half movements, the things that start and stop, the expressions that flash and disappear. Write down what you notice without judgment or interpretation. Simply observe and record. Over time, your eye will sharpen and you will begin catching things you used to miss entirely. Chapter 3. What the voice reveals: tone, pace, and the sound of truth. Close your eyes and think about the last time someone told you they were fine. Now think about whether you actually believed them. Chances are, your doubt had nothing to do with the word itself. The word fine is perfectly neutral. What gave you pause was how it was said. The flatness of the voice. The slight drop in pitch at the end. The pause that came just a fraction too long before the answer arrived. The voice is one of the most revealing channels of human communication, and most of us process its signals intuitively without ever being taught to do so consciously. Vocal analysis in psychology looks at several distinct elements. The first is pace. When people are anxious or excited, they tend to speed up. When they are choosing their words carefully, either because the topic is sensitive or because they are constructing a version of the truth rather than reporting it, they tend to slow down. A sudden change in pace within a single conversation is a meaningful signal. The second element is pitch. Genuine surprise or excitement typically raises the pitch of the voice naturally. Deception or discomfort often produces a very slight rise in baseline pitch as well, a result of the physiological stress response activating the vocal cords differently. Sadness and depression tend to lower pitch and reduce vocal variety, producing a kind of monotone that does not shift much across the emotional range of a conversation. The third element is vocal hesitation. Filler words like and you know are normal in everyday speech. But a sudden increase in these hesitations during a specific part of a conversation, particularly around a specific topic, often indicates that the brain is working harder than usual. That extra cognitive load can signal that someone is managing competing pieces of information, which is precisely what happens during deception or emotional suppression. The fourth and perhaps most underappreciated element is resonance and breath. When people are genuinely relaxed and speaking from a place of authenticity, their voice carries a natural resonance and their breathing is steady. When people are stressed, frightened, or holding something back, the breath tends to become shallower and the voice loses some of its natural warmth. Learning to hear the breath beneath the words is one of the more advanced and more rewarding layers of reading people through sound. Real-life example: Claire's phone call. Claire had been talking with her elderly mother by phone every Sunday for years. One Sunday, her mother called on a Thursday instead and said everything was fine, that she had just missed hearing Claire's voice. Claire noticed that her mother's speech was slightly slower than usual, and that she was pausing at the ends of sentences just a moment longer than normal. She also noticed that her mother's voice sounded like it was coming from higher in her throat than usual. Claire did not accept the surface message. She gently said, "Mom, it sounds like something might be on your mind." Her mother broke down and admitted she had received a difficult medical result that week and had not wanted to worry anyone. Because Claire had learned to listen to the voice beneath the words, she was able to be present for her mother in exactly the right moment. Practical takeaway: the voice, only listen. For 1 week, when you are on the phone with someone important to you, close your eyes and listen only to the sound of their voice, not the content of the words. Notice the pace. Notice the pitch. Notice where the hesitations land. Notice the quality of the breath. You will begin hearing a second conversation happening underneath the first one. And that second conversation is almost always the more honest of the two. Chapter 4. The eyes have it. Gaze, pupil dilation, and what people look at. There is an old saying that the eyes are the windows to the soul. Science has taken that poetic claim and built a fairly rigorous body of evidence around it. The eyes carry more emotional information per square inch than almost any other part of the body, and they do so in ways that are almost entirely outside our conscious control. Eye contact is one of the most powerful social signals human beings exchange. Too much of it reads as threatening or aggressive. Too little reads as dishonest, disinterested, or submissive. The culturally comfortable range in the United States is generally somewhere between 60 and 70% sustained eye contact during conversation, though this varies with context and individual personality. What matters is not a fixed percentage but the pattern relative to what is normal for that person and that relationship. Gaze direction has been studied extensively in the context of memory and cognition. While the popular idea that people look in specific directions depending on whether they are remembering or imagining has been oversimplified in pop psychology, there is solid evidence that gaze aversion, looking away during a difficult question, often signals increased cognitive or emotional effort. The brain is working through something complex. Whether that something is a genuine memory search or the construction of an alternate narrative depends on the full context of the interaction. Pupil dilation is one of the most honest signals the eyes produce because it is entirely involuntary. The pupils expand in low light, yes, but they also expand in response to emotional arousal, including interest, attraction, excitement, and even fear. Research has shown that people's pupils dilate when they look at images or people they find attractive, and they constrict slightly when they encounter something they dislike or find threatening. You cannot fake pupil dilation, and you cannot suppress it. What the eyes do in response to what they see is the body reporting directly on what the subconscious mind is experiencing. Blinking rate is another involuntary signal. The average human blinks between 15 and 20 times per minute under normal conditions. Blinking increases under stress, emotional pressure, and cognitive load. Blinking dramatically decreases when someone is in a highly focused, predatory, or deceptive state. Rapid blinking combined with increased gaze aversion after a specific question is a cluster that deserves closer attention. Real-life example. Nina's first date. Nina had been on enough first dates to know the difference between someone who was genuinely interested and someone who was going through the motions. On this particular date, the man across from her, Tyler, was saying all the right things. He was attentive, funny, and asked thoughtful questions. But Nina noticed that whenever the conversation turned toward anything emotionally substantial, anything that required genuine vulnerability, his eyes would shift toward the window rather than stay with her. He would recover quickly and bring his gaze back, but the pattern was consistent and telling. Nina was not certain what it meant, but she recognized it as a signal that deeper emotional availability might be a challenge for him. She kept that awareness without judgment and continued exploring the connection. Eventually, Tyler himself admitted that he was not great at emotional depth and was actively working on it. Nina appreciated his honesty, which he found easier to give because she had been patient rather than reactive. Her reading of the room had shaped how she moved through the conversation. Practical takeaway. The gaze map. In your next meaningful conversation, pay attention to where the other person's eyes go when you ask a question they have to genuinely think about, and where their eyes go when you ask something you already know the answer to. Build a map of their gaze pattern. When does their gaze stabilize, and when does it wander? The difference will start to tell you something about which questions are landing in familiar territory, and which ones are touching something deeper or more complicated. Chapter 5. Reading the room. Group dynamics and social energy. Most of what we talk about when we talk about reading people happens in one-on-one interactions. But some of the most important people reading happens in groups. A boardroom, a family dinner, a first date that includes friends, a team meeting where the stakes are high. Understanding how people position themselves relative to one another, who defers to whom, who holds the energy, and where the invisible fault lines run, is one of the most socially powerful skills you can develop. Social hierarchies express themselves physically and constantly. The person with the most power or authority in a group tends to take up the most space, physically and conversationally. They lean back rather than forward. They are more comfortable with silence. They are less likely to fill pauses with nervous chatter. They tend to be the first to sit and the last to stand. Other people in the group orient toward them subtly, the way plants orient toward light. Alliances in a group are visible in body language long before they are announced in words. When two people are aligned, their bodies tend to mirror each other. They sit at similar angles. They cross their legs in the same direction. They nod at the same moments. This unconscious physical mirroring is called limbic synchrony, and it happens automatically when people feel connected and in agreement. When you walk into a meeting and scan who is mirroring whom, you are essentially reading the invisible org chart of the room. Exclusion dynamics are equally readable. When someone is being left out of a group conversation, the other members will gradually and usually unconsciously close their body orientation away from that person. They might angle their feet away. They might shorten their responses when that person speaks. They might resume a previous thread of conversation as if the excluded person's contribution had not occurred. These are not always deliberately cruel behaviors. Often they are entirely unconscious. But they are real and they are readable. Status signaling in groups is one of the richest areas to observe. High-status individuals in a group setting tend to move more slowly and deliberately. They do not rush to speak. They are comfortable letting silence stretch. They make fewer apologetic or filler gestures. The small compensatory movements that signal social anxiety, like touching the face repeatedly, laughing before finishing a sentence, or preemptively softening a statement before it is even heard. Low-status individuals in a group tend to move more, speak more quickly when they do speak, and use more verbal and physical hedging behaviors. None of this reflects actual worth or intelligence. It reflects perceived position within a specific social hierarchy at a specific moment in time, and those hierarchies shift constantly depending on context. Mirroring deserves special attention because it is one of the most powerful and least conscious signals of social alignment. When two people are deeply engaged in conversation, their bodies will naturally synchronize. They will shift to the same side at roughly the same moment. They will mirror each other's hand gestures. They will breathe at similar rates. This synchrony is driven by the brain's mirror neuron system, a network of neurons that activates both when we perform an action and when we observe someone else performing it. Mirroring is essentially the body's way of saying, "I am with you." It is a biological expression of rapport. You can observe who is mirroring whom in a group to understand the invisible map of alliance and affection in that room. You can also consciously introduce mirroring in your own interactions to build rapport, though it works most powerfully when it arises naturally from genuine engagement rather than as a technique. One of the most useful skills in group dynamics is understanding who holds the social energy of a room versus who holds the formal authority. These are often not the same person. The person with the title might be the manager, but the person everyone looks at first when news is announced. The person whose laugh gives others permission to laugh. The person who can redirect a conversation with a single phrase. That person is holding the real social energy. Identifying this person quickly is one of the most powerful moves you can make in any group setting. Real-life example, Diane's team observation. Diane was brought in as a consultant to evaluate a struggling sales team at a mid-sized company. She sat in on 3 meetings before saying a word. She was not listening primarily to the content of the meetings. She was watching. She noticed that every time the team leader made a proposal, the group would pause and look briefly toward a quiet woman named Angela before responding. Angela was not the team leader. She did not have the most impressive title, but she was clearly the social anchor of the room. Diane met with Angela privately and discovered she had serious reservations about the team's direction that she had not felt comfortable raising in group settings. Diane brought those concerns forward in a structured way, and the result was a shift in strategy that the whole team rallied behind. Reading the room had identified the most important voice in that organization, and it had not been the loudest one. Practical takeaway: the energy audit. The next time you are in a group setting of 5 or more people, do an energy audit. Ask yourself 3 questions. Who does the group look at first when something significant happens? Who do people physically orient toward when they speak? And who has the ability to shift the mood of the entire room with a single comment or expression? The answers to those 3 questions will tell you more about the real dynamics of that group than 6 months of meeting minutes ever could. Chapter 6. The Truth About Lying. What Deception Actually Looks Like. Here is something that surprises most people. Research consistently shows that the average person is only slightly better than chance at detecting when someone is lying. Police officers, judges, and even trained psychologists without specific deception training typically perform at rates not dramatically better than a coin flip. The idea that you can reliably spot a liar by watching for nose touching or eye shifting is mostly a myth that popular culture has enthusiastically promoted and science has repeatedly failed to confirm. So what does the science actually say? The first thing it says is that there is no single reliable cue to deception. There is no Pinocchio signal. What deception research does support is that lying imposes a cognitive load. When you lie, your brain is doing multiple things simultaneously. It is generating the false information. It is monitoring whether the false information is believable. It is watching the other person's reaction and adjusting in real time. And it is suppressing the true information, which keeps trying to surface. All of that mental activity has to go somewhere. And it tends to leak out in the form of behavioral inconsistencies rather than any one specific tell. What to look for is not a single gesture but a pattern of increased cognitive effort relative to the person's baseline. Speech that becomes suddenly more formal or more careful. Micro pauses before answering direct questions. A decrease in illustrative gestures, the hand movements people use naturally when they are describing something they have genuinely experienced or thought about. Verbal distancing, which is when people use language that creates psychological space between themselves and the event in question, saying the money instead of my money, or that happened instead of I did that. Another important concept is statement analysis. When people are recounting genuine events, their stories tend to have sensory detail, emotional content, and nonlinear elements. Memory is not a recording. It is a reconstruction, and genuine reconstructions feel messy and human. When stories are fabricated, they tend to be unusually linear, suspiciously clean, and often lacking in sensory or emotional detail, because those details have to be invented rather than remembered. A story that sounds too smooth and too perfectly organized may actually be less reliable than one that wanders and contradicts itself slightly. Real-life example. Kevin and the contractor. Kevin hired a contractor to renovate his kitchen. Midway through the project, the contractor said the project was running behind because of a supplier delay. Kevin asked him directly what the supplier had said when he called to check on the timeline. The contractor's response was immediately more formal than his usual speech. He paused slightly longer than normal and then gave an answer that described the situation without any of the conversational texture that genuine memory usually carries. There were no quotes from the supplier, no specific names, no recollection of where he had been when he made the call. Kevin probed gently and the story shifted slightly with each follow-up question. Another sign of construction rather than recall. Kevin hired a different contractor to finish the job and discovered the original work had significant code violations the first contractor had been trying to avoid disclosing. Reading the behavioral signals of that conversation saved Kevin tens of thousands of dollars in potential liability. Practical takeaway. The baseline deception test. The next time you want to calibrate someone's truthful baseline, ask them to tell you about something you already know is true. A recent trip. Something they did last weekend. An opinion on a subject they have clearly thought about. Listen to how their voice sounds, how much gesture and sensory detail they use, how linear or non-linear the story is. That is their honest storytelling style. Now you have a comparison point for the next time you need to evaluate something you cannot independently verify. Chapter 7. Emotional Intelligence as a Reading Tool. Empathy, Projection, and Resonance. Reading people is not only a cognitive skill, it is deeply emotional. Some of the most accurate reads of other human beings come not from intellectual analysis, but from tuning into what you yourself feel in someone's presence. The body of another person creates an emotional field, and your nervous system is already reading it whether you are consciously engaged in that process or not. This is the basis of what psychologists and neuroscientists refer to as emotional resonance, the ability of one person's emotional state to activate corresponding feeling states in another. It is why you feel heavy when you walk into a room where someone has been crying, even before you know anything is wrong. It is why some people leave you feeling energized and others leave you feeling inexplicably drained. Your nervous system is picking up on signals that your rational mind has not yet processed, and those signals are enormously informative. Empathy, in its most functional form, is not simply about feeling sorry for someone or being sympathetic to their situation. It is about accurately modeling the interior experience of another person. It requires two simultaneous skills. The first is the ability to set aside your own perspective enough to genuinely inhabit another person's point of view. The second is the ability to keep yourself distinct enough from that experience that you do not lose your own center in the process. People who are highly empathically attuned tend to be excellent at reading others, but they often struggle with what is sometimes called projection, the unconscious tendency to attribute your own feelings and interpretations to the other person. If you are anxious about a conversation, you might read the other person's neutral expression as hostile. If you are excited about a plan, you might read a politely listening face as enthusiastic. Projection is the shadow side of empathy, and learning to distinguish what you are genuinely picking up from what you are unconsciously generating is one of the central disciplines of reading people accurately. One powerful way to build this distinction is the practice of checking your reads. When you get an intuitive sense about what someone is feeling, ask yourself first whether that feeling resonates with anything you yourself are carrying into the conversation. If it does, hold your read more loosely. Seek additional signals. If the feeling is completely distinct from your own emotional state and yet persists across multiple channels of communication, that is a much stronger signal. There is a concept in somatic psychology called interoception, which is the ability to perceive the internal state of your own body. People with higher interoceptive awareness, those who are more attuned to the physical sensations in their own bodies, tend to be more accurate readers of other people's emotions. This is not a coincidence. The body processes social information before the conscious mind does. A knot in the stomach, a tightening in the chest, a sudden sense of lightness or ease. These physical responses are often the first and most honest signals of what is actually happening in an interpersonal exchange. Building interoceptive awareness means learning to check in with your body regularly, not just in high-stakes moments but throughout ordinary daily life. What does your chest feel like right now as you breathe? What does your jaw feel like? Your shoulders? Your belly? When you become fluent in reading the ongoing physical state of your own body, you become far more capable of noticing when that state shifts in response to another person, and that shift is your nervous system sending you a report on what it is reading in them. The mirror neuron system, which we touched on in the chapter on group dynamics, plays a central role here as well. Mirror neurons fire both when you perform an action and when you observe someone else performing it. This means that when you watch someone express an emotion, your brain is literally simulating that emotion internally. You are not merely observing their sadness or their joy from the outside. You are generating a version of it inside yourself. That internal generation is what makes empathy possible, and it is also what makes reading emotional states possible, even when no explicit expression has been made. Real-life example. Priya's team meeting. Priya was a senior manager who had developed a reputation for understanding her team in ways that went beyond what was on paper. One afternoon, she walked into a team meeting and immediately felt something heavy in the room before a single word was spoken. She noticed that two specific team members were sitting further apart than usual, that both were holding their bodies slightly more rigidly than their normal relaxed posture, and that the usual warm ambient conversation that preceded meetings was entirely absent. Priya did not launch into the agenda. She said simply, "Before we get started, how is everyone actually doing?" One team member exhaled audibly with relief, and the conversation that followed revealed a tension between two colleagues that had been affecting the whole team's energy for weeks. Addressing it directly took 20 minutes and resolved what had been building for a month. Priya's willingness to trust what she felt in her own nervous system before analyzing it intellectually was what made the intervention possible. Practical takeaway: the felt sense check. Before your next important conversation, take 30 seconds to notice how you feel in your own body. Relaxed or tense? Open or guarded? Clear or foggy? This is your starting point. After the conversation, notice how you feel again. What changed? What carried over from the other person into your own system? You are not looking for a formula, you are building fluency with your own emotional senses, because those senses are always reading the room, whether you are directing them consciously or not. Chapter 8. Personality Maps. Understanding types without putting people in boxes. Every person you meet is a universe. No framework can fully contain them. And yet, patterns exist. Personality research conducted across decades and across cultures has identified consistent ways that human beings tend to organize their experience, relate to others, manage stress, and pursue meaning. Understanding those patterns does not limit your perception of individuals. It gives you a better starting map so you can navigate toward deeper understanding more efficiently. The Big Five personality model, which is the most empirically supported framework in modern psychology, identifies 5 broad dimensions along which people vary. These are openness to experience, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and emotional stability. Every person sits somewhere on each of these 5 spectrums, and where they sit has enormous implications for how they communicate, what they value, how they handle conflict, and what kind of environment allows them to do their best work. High openness tends to show up as intellectual curiosity, comfort with ambiguity, and a preference for novelty. People high in openness respond well to ideas framed as possibilities, and tend to disengage when conversations become overly procedural without connecting to bigger meaning. People lower in openness tend to prefer concrete plans, established processes, and proven approaches. They respond better to data and precedent than to speculation and possibility. High conscientiousness tends to show up as attention to detail, follow-through, punctuality, and a preference for structure. These individuals often feel genuine discomfort when plans are unclear or expectations are vague. High agreeableness tends to show up as warmth, cooperation, and a strong orientation toward relationship harmony. These individuals often have difficulty with direct conflict and may agree in the moment while privately disagreeing, which is why creating a safe and low-pressure environment is essential for getting their honest input. High extroversion draws energy from social interaction and tends to think out loud. These individuals often process by talking. Introverted individuals tend to need time with their own thoughts before sharing and may have their deepest insights available only after the conversation is over, not during it. Understanding this single dimension can transform how you structure important discussions. None of these dimensions are better or worse than their opposites. They are simply different ways of being human. The goal is not to categorize and dismiss, but to understand and adapt. There is another layer of personality that goes beyond traits and into what psychologists call core motivational systems. Every person is fundamentally oriented by one or more dominant motivations. Some people are primarily driven by achievement, the desire to accomplish, master, and excel. Some are primarily driven by affiliation, the desire for belonging, connection, and harmony with others. Some are primarily driven by influence, the desire to lead, persuade, and shape outcomes. And some are primarily driven by security, the desire for predictability, stability, and protection from risk. These motivational orientations are not fixed or exclusive, but one or two tend to dominate. And recognizing which one is running in the person across from you is enormously useful. A person whose core motivation is affiliation will respond very differently to feedback than a person whose core motivation is achievement. The achiever wants to know specifically what to fix and how to do better. The affiliator wants to know that the relationship is safe, even in the context of the feedback. Delivering the same message without accounting for this difference is one of the most common communication failures in professional and personal relationships alike. Values are the third layer worth understanding. What someone prioritizes when they have to choose between competing goods tells you more about them than almost anything else. Does someone consistently choose safety over adventure, loyalty over individual advancement, honesty over harmony, justice over mercy? These are not easy questions, and most people have never explicitly articulated their own value hierarchy. But their behavior over time reveals it. And when you understand someone's value hierarchy, you understand the lens through which they interpret every experience, including their experience of you. Real-life example. Alex and his colleague Mona. Alex was a project manager who prided himself on running tight, efficient meetings. He would come in with a detailed agenda, move through items quickly, and expect responses in real time. He kept running into friction with a colleague named Mona, who seemed disengaged in meetings but would send brilliant follow-up emails hours later. After learning about introversion and the way highly introverted people process information, Alex started sharing key agenda items 24 hours before meetings and explicitly invited written responses as an alternative to verbal contributions in the room. Mona's engagement transformed. Her insights became part of the live conversation because Alex had created a pathway that matched her cognitive style. That one adjustment improved the quality of their entire team's output. Practical takeaway. The 5 questions. When you meet someone new or need to understand a colleague better, listen across several conversations for signals of each big 5 dimension. Do they gravitate toward ideas or toward implementation? Do they keep their commitments with precision or loosely? Do they energize in groups or after time alone? Do they avoid disagreement or engage it directly? Do they remain steady under pressure or do they become reactive? These 5 questions will give you a working map of how to communicate with that person in ways that actually land. Chapter 9. What People Do Not Say, The Power of Silence and Omission. There is a form of communication that most people completely overlook. It is not a word, a gesture, or an expression. It is absence. What someone does not say is often more revealing than what they do say. What a person avoids, deflects, minimizes, or simply does not mention when they logically should have is a signal as clear as any the body could produce. Omission in conversation takes several forms. The first is strategic deflection, changing the subject when a specific topic arises without acknowledging the change. People do this unconsciously when a topic triggers discomfort and consciously when they are trying to avoid accountability. The second is minimization, acknowledging something but in a way that dramatically reduces its apparent significance. "Oh, that was nothing," said about something that was clearly meaningful, is a form of omission through understatement. The third form is narrative gaps. When someone tells you a story about something significant in their life and certain periods, certain relationships, or certain decisions are conspicuously missing from the telling, those gaps deserve gentle attention. We narrate around what is painful or what we are not ready to examine. The negative space in a person's self-story is often where the most important material lives. The fourth form of omission is what researchers sometimes call the absent pronoun, a pattern where someone discussing their own behavior consistently removes themselves from their own story linguistically. "Things got complicated," instead of "I made things complicated." "There was a lot of conflict," instead of "I was part of that conflict." The disappearing first-person singular in a story about one's own actions is often a signal of some degree of discomfort with personal accountability. It is not definitive, and it can also reflect genuine uncertainty rather than evasion, but it is worth noting when it appears consistently. What people emphasize is as revealing as what they omit. The details that a person volunteers without being asked, the things they come back to repeatedly across a conversation, the topics that seem to generate more energy or animation than everything else. These are signals about what actually matters to them at a deep level. When someone says they are over a past relationship but keeps finding ways to reference it, the mentions themselves are more informative than the claim. When someone insists a situation is fine, but keeps circling back to describe it in greater and greater detail, the circling is the signal. Attention follows importance, and importance does not always announce itself with explicit words. Silence itself is one of the most powerful tools available to someone who wants to understand others. Most people are deeply uncomfortable with silence in conversation and will fill it. The person who can sit with silence without anxiety, without rushing to fill it with a question or a comment or reassurance, creates space for the other person to go deeper. What people say when they are given more time and more space is often more honest and more complete than what they would have said if the conversation had moved at a faster pace. The strategic use of silence is not about manipulation. It is about respect. It signals that you have the patience and the genuine interest to hear what the other person actually wants to say, rather than what they can produce under conversational pressure. The most skilled listeners in the world understand that their job is not to talk. It is to create the conditions in which the other person can reveal themselves most fully. Real-life example. Tasha and her mentor. Tasha was meeting with a mentor to discuss a recent professional setback. She told a clear, organized story of what had happened, but she never once mentioned how she had felt during any of it. Her mentor, Dr. Reyes, noticed the emotional absence in an otherwise detailed account. Rather than asking a direct question about feelings, which Tasha might have deflected, Dr. Reyes simply sat with the silence after Tasha finished speaking. A full 12 seconds passed. Tasha began to cry. Not because Dr. Reyes had said anything particularly wise, but because the silence had held space for what Tasha had been carefully omitting from her story. The feelings she had organized entirely out of the telling came flooding in. That session became a turning point because a mentor had been skilled enough to say nothing. Practical takeaway: the silence practice. In your next conversation with someone you care about, practice extending your silences after they speak. Instead of responding immediately, wait 2 to 3 beats longer than feels comfortable. Notice what happens. Notice what they add. When given more space, notice what surfaces when the pressure to perform disappears. You will discover that some of the most important things people say are the things that arrive after the initial answer, in the space that silence creates. Chapter 10. Reading Yourself, the Foundation of Reading Others. Here is the most important chapter in this entire conversation, and it might surprise you. The single greatest obstacle to accurately reading other people is a poor understanding of yourself. Every perception you have of another person passes through the lens of your own unresolved experiences, your own fears, your own desires, and your own patterns of relating to the world. If you have not examined those lenses, you are reading other people through distortion without knowing it. The most sophisticated toolkit of behavioral science will not help you if the interpreter is compromised. Self-knowledge is not a soft or secondary skill. It is the foundation of every other skill in this conversation. When you understand your own emotional triggers, you stop projecting them onto others. When you understand your own defensive patterns, you stop misreading defensiveness in others. When you understand what you want to be true about a person or a situation, you stop confirming those wishes with selective attention to the signals that support them and willful blindness to the signals that do not. Confirmation bias is the most common enemy of accurate people reading. It is the tendency of the human mind to seek and emphasize information that confirms what it already believes and to discount or simply not perceive information that challenges those beliefs. We do not see what is there. We see what we expect to see, and what we expect to see is largely shaped by what we have already decided, consciously or not. The antidote to confirmation bias in reading people is deliberate openness, the practice of actively seeking disconfirming evidence. When you have formed an impression of someone, ask yourself what you might be missing. What signals have you noticed but minimized? What has the other person said or done that does not fit your current read? What would a person with no prior relationship to this individual notice that you might be filtering out? Emotional regulation is the second pillar of accurate self-reading. When you are flooded with your own emotion, whether that is anxiety, excitement, anger, or grief, your perceptual field narrows dramatically. You become less able to read nuance. You become more reactive and less observant. Building the capacity to stay emotionally regulated in high-stakes conversations is not about becoming cold or detached. It is about keeping your perceptual channels open even when the stakes are high. Real-life example: Marco's hiring mistake. Marco was a department head who had hired and managed teams for years. He prided himself on his instincts about people. One cycle, he hired a candidate named Victor who reminded him strongly of himself at an earlier stage of his career. Ambitious, confident, a little rough around the edges but clearly talented. Every signal that might have given Marco pause: Victor's tendency to dominate group conversations, his subtle dismissiveness of peers, his tendency to overpromise, Marco reframed through the lens of his own identity. He saw his younger self rather than a distinct individual with different patterns. Victor struggled significantly in the role. Several team members quit partly as a result of the interpersonal dynamics. Marco, reviewing what had happened, realized that he had been reading himself projected onto Victor rather than reading Victor. It was one of the most expensive and instructive lessons of his leadership career, and it permanently changed how he conducted his hiring process. He started explicitly asking himself before every final decision, "What am I hoping to see in this person, and have I been honest about what I am actually seeing?" Practical takeaway: the personal lens inventory. Take 20 minutes this week and write answers to these 4 questions. First, what kinds of people do I tend to immediately like or trust, and why? Second, what kinds of people do I tend to be suspicious of or uncomfortable around, and why? Third, what qualities in others tend to trigger a strong emotional reaction in me? And fourth, what have I believed about a person that later turned out to be entirely wrong, and what had I missed? These 4 questions will not give you perfect self-knowledge. Nothing will. But they will make your lenses visible. And a visible lens is one you can account for when you are reading someone else. Chapter 11. Putting it all together. The art of the full spectrum read. You have now moved through 10 distinct dimensions of reading people: body language and baseline behavior, microexpressions and emotional leakage, the voice and its layers, the eyes and what they track, group dynamics and social energy, the real signals of deception, empathy and projection, personality frameworks, the power of silence and omission, and the essential foundation of self-knowledge. Each of these is a lens, and reading people well is not about applying one lens at a time in sequence. It is about holding all of them simultaneously, the way a skilled musician holds melody, rhythm, harmony, and dynamics at once, not thinking separately about each element but integrating them into a single fluid experience. A full-spectrum read of another person begins before a word is spoken. You notice how they carry themselves when they walk in. You notice their baseline energy. You calibrate your own internal state, so that your own emotional noise is as minimal as possible. You listen to the voice beneath the words. You watch the face for the flashes. You notice what they say and what they do not say. You feel the emotional field they are generating. And you check your own nervous system's response against your own known patterns and biases. And then, having gathered all of that, you hold your interpretation loosely. Because reading people is not about arriving at certainty. It is about developing informed hypotheses that you continually revise as new information comes in. The most skilled readers of people are not those who are confident about everyone they meet. They are those who remain genuinely curious about every person, because they understand that even the most sophisticated read is still a read, not a fact. There is no finish line in this work. The most experienced therapists, the most decorated negotiators, the most insightful leaders will all tell you the same thing if you ask them honestly. Every person is still a mystery. Every conversation still holds the possibility of surprise. The skill is not about eliminating that mystery. It is about becoming comfortable enough with uncertainty that you can stay genuinely present and genuinely curious, even when you cannot resolve everything you are observing into a clean and settled picture. That tolerance for ambiguity, the ability to sit with partial information and continue engaging openly rather than collapsing prematurely into a fixed interpretation, is perhaps the highest expression of everything this conversation has been about. It is also one of the rarest qualities a human being can possess. Most people rush towards certainty because uncertainty feels threatening, but the person who can hold the question open, who can say, "I do not fully understand this person yet, and I am interested in staying in that not knowing until something clearer emerges," that person is doing something genuinely extraordinary. The goal is connection, not analysis. The goal of reading people is not to have power over them or to outmaneuver them. It is to understand them well enough to meet them where they actually are, rather than where you assume them to be. It is to create the conditions for genuine communication, authentic relationship, and the kind of trust that can only be built when people feel truly seen. That is the deepest gift that reading people offers. Not an advantage, not a tactical edge, but the ability to offer another human being the experience of being understood, which is one of the most profound things one person can give to another. Here is what that kind of integrated reading looks like in practice. Not in a controlled research setting, but in the kind of ordinary, complicated, emotionally loaded moment that defines most of the significant relationships in a person's life. Real-life example. Elena and her father. Elena had a complicated relationship with her father for most of her adult life. He was a man of very few words, and she had always interpreted his emotional distance as indifference. She had spent years feeling unseen by him, and had largely stopped trying to connect. After immersing herself in everything she could learn about reading people, Elena came home for the holidays with a different approach. She stopped trying to get him to talk and instead started watching. She noticed the way his face softened slightly when she walked in the door, a micro-movement she had never registered before. She noticed the way his posture changed when she was nearby versus when she was across the room. She noticed that he stayed in whatever room she was in, moving quietly from space to space the way a person moves toward warmth without wanting to announce it. She began to understand that his language was not verbal. It had never been verbal. He expressed care through presence and action, and the kind of subtle behavioral signals she had spent years learning to read but had never turned toward her own family. The relationship did not become dramatically different overnight, but Elena stopped feeling unseen because she finally understood that her father had been communicating with her in the only language he had, and she had simply not learned to read it yet. Conclusion. The most important skill you will ever develop. You started this conversation as a person who already had the instinct for reading people. Everyone does. It is built into our biology, shaped by millions of years of social evolution. What you have done here is begin to make that instinct conscious, to give it language and structure and practice so that it can become something reliable and intentional rather than something that only works when you happen to be in a good mood or paying close attention. Reading people is not a party trick. It is not something you do to impress anyone or to gain an advantage in some zero-sum game of social maneuvering. It is the foundation of every meaningful relationship you will ever have, every effective team you will ever be part of, every difficult conversation you will ever navigate, and every moment of genuine human connection you will ever experience. The world is full of people who are speaking constantly and being heard very little. The person who learns to truly listen, not just to words but to the whole human being behind them, becomes rare and invaluable. They become the person that others trust instinctively, because on some level, even unconsciously, people can feel when they are being truly seen. There is a responsibility that comes with this skill. When you can read people accurately, you have access to information they have not explicitly chosen to share with you. That access is a form of trust, even when it has not been consciously extended. The ethical use of this skill means using what you perceive to serve the other person and the relationship, not to exploit vulnerability or to gain leverage. It means asking yourself regularly whether you are reading people in order to connect more deeply with them or in order to manipulate them more efficiently. Those are two completely different projects, and only one of them is worth your time. It also means holding your reads with genuine humility. The most accurate reader of people in any room is still only reading a portion of the truth. Human beings are irreducibly complex. They change moment to moment. They contain contradictions. They surprise themselves. No framework, no matter how sophisticated, will ever give you complete certainty about another person. And the moment you believe it has, you have stopped learning and started projecting. Keep your curiosity alive. The moment you think you have someone fully figured out is often the moment you miss the most important thing about them. The practice of reading people is ultimately a practice of attention. Sustained, generous, non-judgmental attention is the rarest and most valuable thing you can offer another human being. In a world that increasingly rewards speed, multitasking, and surface-level efficiency, the person who knows how to slow down and genuinely attend to another person has access to a quality of connection that most people spend their entire lives searching for and never quite finding. You are not the same as everyone else who walked into a room today, operating on assumptions and projections and the surface of conversations. You are now someone who understands that every person you meet is sending you a signal at every moment, with their body, their voice, their face, their silences, their stories, and their energy. And you have made the decision to learn how to receive those signals with care, with curiosity, and with the kind of deep respect for other human beings that makes all genuine understanding possible. Start where you are. Practice in the conversations you are already having. Watch more, listen more, assume less. Revise your reads as new information arrives. Be curious rather than certain. And above all, remember that every skill in this conversation ultimately comes back to one foundational truth. The better you understand yourself, the better you will understand everyone else. This is the science of reading people. It is also the art of being more fully human. Go practice it.